Here's an excellent question for you to practice. Tips. Describe and graph the relation absolute x plus absolute y equals to 1. I'm Anil Kumar, and in this video we will discuss how to graph combination of absolute function. When we say tips, is thinking, inquiry, problem solving. So this question really requires all the aspects. Absolute x plus absolute y equals to 1. Let us try to isolate y from this equation. So we have absolute x plus absolute y equals to 1. So you can isolate y, so you get absolute y equals to minus absolute x plus 1. Now absolute value means positive value always, correct? So what we can also write this as, we can think about this function as y equals to minus absolute value, right, of x plus 1, and whatever we get from here we can find its absolute value like this. So what we get is y, and that is our function. So that is how we can define our function. Now with this, let's try to sketch the graph. So we'll follow simple transformations, starting with the parent function absolute x, and then sketch our function. So let us say that's our coordinate axis, right? So I'm not using a graph paper here, but you should actually plot it on a graph paper. I'll also recommend that you can make a table of values, right? So that is to say that you can make a table of values kind of like this, where you can have x values and y values. So for different x values you can have different y values. Let us say we have minus 4, minus 3, minus 2, minus 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, correct? Now corresponding to these values you can calculate the y values, plot them, and you'll get your graph. That is probably the easiest way of sketching this graph. Okay, so you can always calculate and figure this out. There are some critical values which I'll calculate for you. So let's start with 0. If x is 0 we get 1. So for this x equals to 0 we get y as 1. If it is minus 1 or plus 1, absolute value will be plus 1. So minus and plus 1 will give me 0. So these are my zeros. For minus 2 or for plus 2, absolute value will be plus 2. Minus 2 plus 1 will give me minus 1. So we get minus 1 here. For plus and minus 3, absolute value of minus 3 is also plus 3, correct? So we get minus 3 plus 1, which is minus 2, right? So likewise you'll get your values, and this will be y value of minus 3. But when you do absolute of that, then you have to make positive, right? So the output is actually positive for all this. That is this absolute, correct? So when you do this, you'll get these values as for 0 it is 1, and then as shown on the table you can calculate these values, right? So that is absolute of y. So what we did is we calculated inside values and then made them positive because of this absolute function. Okay, now let us see if we have to sketch it with the help of transformations, how are we going to do it? Let's start from inside. So we'll take this function minus of absolute x. You know, absolute x is a function which is like this. When we do negative of that, so we get reflection on x-axis. That is, this is minus absolute x, right? Now when you say minus absolute x plus 1, in that case we move it one spot upright, and then every point goes one position up. So you get a function which is kind of like this. So this is minus of absolute x plus 1. Now if you have to sketch absolute y, which is absolute of all this, that means all the positive part remains same, but the negative part flips, right? So it becomes kind of like this. So this portion flips, right? So we have this as our function, right? So this part remains same, which is kind of same, right? So this is your absolute y. Is it okay? Which means absolute of this value, right? Which is absolute of minus x plus 1. So that kind of W shape is the graph which represents your equation, correct? So that is how you can sketch the graph of the given function. Now here's another question for you. It says model a piecewise equation to model the graph. So what we need to do now is write a piecewise equation for this particular graph, right? So from here we have, let us say, our function f of x. So if I have to write f of x from the graph, then how can I write it? So that is what the question is. So what we can do here is, we can think about it like two absolute functions, one shifted left to minus 1, the other one shifted right to plus 1, right? So we could write this as a piecewise function, which is f of x equals to 2 pieces. So this one is moved left, so it is absolute x plus 1. If x is less than, we can include 0 on this side, less than equal to 0, right? In that case, it is absolute value of x plus 1, but the other half is when x greater than 0, so we can say that is absolute value of x minus 1 when x is greater than 0, right? So that is how you can actually from the graph get equation which will represent your function. I hope that is interesting and you like the video. You can subscribe to my videos and learn more about functions. Thank you and all the best.